Okay, for this last lecture in this module, we'll be discussing, basically we'll continue on with the discussion of an analyzing society, but now we're going to shift gears as to these other lectures. We've been discussing things from a macro sociological standpoint. We've been talking about the larger elements of society. In this section, we're going to discuss society from the viewpoint of micro-sociology, so looking at things more on the level of individuals and their interactions. So we're back to our discussion of the sociological perspectives. We're much more likely to be talking about the type of sociology focused on by symbolic interactionists. And we're going to see clearly that a lot of the things that I'm going to be discussing are centered on, like we said, the individual behavior, the behavior of individuals within a society, as well as an interpretation of the very meaning of symbols, both in society and among societies. So, one of the things we can definitely talk about is this idea of stereotypes, discussing what those are. We talk about cultural definitions about characteristics of other individuals that influence our interactions with them. Okay, so in a very broad sociological definition, is anything that we think about another person that in some way might influence how we're going to interact with that person. So in society, we often hear stereotypes, and we tend to think of things like especially racial or gender stereotypes, and we tend to think of stereotypes as being bad or things that we shouldn't engage in, or that we make the attempt not to engage in, or we might say things like, oh, I don't stereotype people. But again, that's not looking at things from a sociological definition. Sociological definition obviously is non-biased. We're not looking at the goodness or badness of these things, but we're just recognizing that we are in some ways all influenced by assumptions that we make about other people that are going to influence how we interact with them. And once again, I can sometimes challenge a classroom to say, do any of you routinely use stereotypes when you interact with people in society? And once again, we're kind of automatically trained to be like, no, 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 I don't do that, that's wrong. I would never, ever stereotype anybody. And then it's when I challenge people and say, that's absolutely incorrect. We all do it on a regular basis. And in some cases, it's not even necessarily a bad or a wrong thing to do. It's something that just happens. But if we can study it and acknowledge it, then we're much more likely to recognize when it is being constructive or destructive, or is serving a function or being dysfunctional. But the example I usually give, okay, so I think, again, when I say, do you use stereotypes, or do stereotypes influence your interactions with people, automatically people are thinking most typically about race or ethnicity, and saying, no, I would never not talk to somebody because they're the different race or ethnic group than I am, because again, we've kind of been trained not to think that way, or think of stereotypes in a negative way. But the challenge I usually give people is, are we influenced by our interpretations of other people's attractiveness? And that's usually when you'll see people kind of do the nod and go, oh, well, yes. And I'm saying, you know, even for those of you who are nodding, you still need to admit that we make assumptions about who another person is based on our interpretations, their physical attractiveness or other characteristics about them. And those will absolutely, definitely influence, even if it's just a casual interaction with someone. We may talk to them a little bit longer. We may make more eye contact, which we're going to talk about in a minute. We may, like I said, kind of draw the conversation out a little bit longer, or it might be more polite, or we might smile more when we're interacting with somebody we define as being attractive, as well as maybe when we find other people's maybe physical or personality characteristics as unattractive. We may be quicker than to kind of shut down those interactions with them, maybe move on, be a little more short with our answers, and just try to get the thing over with, right? Those are just basically assumptions we're making about another person based on our cultural beliefs or cultural standards. So we all engage to a certain degree in stereotypes. It's just a matter of recognizing. And when we get to the module on race and ethnic studies, we'll talk about some of the dysfunctions associated with making stereotypes. We can define things like personal space, cultural definitions of how close we like to be to other people. And in our society, we can clearly say that there's a wide variety of how close individuals feel with this, but we can also talk about culturally defined standards, and then we can cross-compare them. So we can say the American standard of personal space is much different, perhaps, than, let's say, the Japanese definition of cultural space, or I'm sorry, personal space. So In our society, generally we have definitions based on how well we know somebody. So if you know somebody very well, it's nothing to go up to them. Among guys, it's the bro hug, or girls would give each other a big hug and a kiss. Sometimes it's gender defined, what's appropriate in some circumstances. Whereas, as I said, if we compare other cultures, contact between males and females in a lot of Arabic cultures is absolutely forbidden even under any circumstances. Or in, let's say, Japanese culture, two people meeting each other for the first time will make no physical contact with one another and bow. And even if the people have known each other for a very long time and might consider to be close acquaintances, they might never actually touch or make physical contact with that other person. So these are culturally defined distances, and when we talk about our own society, we can actually talk about kind of distant zones. And if we look at American culture, we can clearly identify the idea of personal space, and I give this example quite a bit of the time. About 18 inches out from your body is what we call our most personal or intimate space. And if you want to kind of exemplify that, take one hand and touch your thumb to your chest, and then touch your other thumb to your pinky finger and hold them out, okay? So in this situation, we can clearly see it's about 18 inches away from our body, and I usually then ask students, and sometimes get very laughing like degrees, what kind of contact occurs within that space? And sometimes when people are giggling out of embarrassment, they're absolutely right. Sexual experiences occur in that space, hugging, kissing, but we even talk about ideas like the bro hug, or even greeting somebody by shaking their hand. You're usually within a certain amount of distance of them. We're not certainly shaking people's hands, way out here. It's this. But the definition for us culturally is that we invite people into that space. So if anybody's ever seen the Seinfeld episode of The Close Talker, who is the close talker? The person who walks right up to you and wants to have a conversation this close to you. And typically, unless we've invited somebody into that space, we feel pretty uncomfortable with that. So what will we do? We'll tend to either back away from that person, or we tend to push that person out of our space and say, you're invading my personal space. So these are cultural definitions that we have about this idea of intimate space. When we go on to this idea about distance zones, and we usually talk about personal space, kind of extending out to what we sometimes, call conversational space, from about 18 inches, so beyond this measure that we were using, out to about 2 feet. And again, called conversational space. This is where we like to talk to people. So if the person's a close talker, we're going to back them up about a foot, foot and a half, and say, okay, you stand over there. Or better yet, if you've ever been in a situation where somebody's screaming at you from down the hall, or worse, from another room or up the stairs, what's our typical response? Come here where I can talk to you. Come stand in a spot where I can engage you comfortably. So we have this idea. Then we talk about social space, which is usually about 2 feet out to about maybe 20 feet or so. Again, if I was in a classroom, I'd usually say it's kind of the space we're in right now, where we have definite rules about behavior. As students, you're all sitting facing me. As I'm an instructor, I'm standing facing you. Could I just as easily teach the class from behind you, sitting down? Sure, but that would violate a lot of our rules about what goes on in these social spaces. So we have lots of culturally defined ideas about how we're supposed to behave. Then we can go out beyond public space. So we talk about, beyond 20 feet, what type of behavior do we engage in with other people there? Well, then we talk about things like concerts and sporting events and political rallies and large gatherings. And depending on each of those, we'll have definite rules about how we're supposed to behave and interact with each other. Again, if you're talking about going to a concert, it would pretty much stink if everybody was on the same level and only the people up front got to see the band, right? We would say, no, you have to elevate the band above everybody, or you have to put the rest of the crowd up in some type of bleacher section so everybody can see. So we have all these ideas about how we utilize and interact with each other based on these culturally defined ideas of personal space. We can talk about eye contact and body language. Clearly, the one thing that was almost pretty much a universal is that eye contact signals intimacy. That when we're looking into another person's eyes, is the old saying, eyes are the windows to the soul. So when we're looking into somebody's eyes, we're signaling a sense of intimacy. But culturally, we make different definitions about what type of eye contact is acceptable. In our society, in America, what are we told about eye contact? It's a signal of or a sign of respect. So if you're being told to go to a job interview, one of the things you're going to get told is make eye contact as an instructor. I'm told make eye contact with all my students, so I'm walking around the room making sure that I'm engaging you and that I can also see whether or not you're paying attention. So in our society, we're told that eye contact is clearly a sign of respect. Again, if we were in Japan and you were meeting somebody for the first time, the most respectful thing you can do is avoid eye contact. In fact, the greeting is a bow where you keep your head down and you only make eye contact after introductions are made and it's been established that eye contact can be made. Okay? So we have very different rules for eye contact going along with that, and this sounds very similar to what we talked about in Module 2. We talked about gestures, is the idea of body language, being able to make interpretations about the way that other people hold themselves, posture. If I were to walk into a classroom and not say a word and just walk to the front of the classroom and do this, I think a lot of students would interpret that as, uh-oh, we've done something wrong, okay? Or better yet, you know, I'm going to stand here with my hands on my hips, okay? These are widely regarded as symbols that you are angry with or frustrated with somebody, and again, the person interpreting those is going to react to that in their own way. When we're studying microsociology and looking at things, especially from a symbolic interactionist point of view, the sociologist Erving Goffman introduced the idea of dramaturgy, the idea that if you want to study human interactions in society, he used the analogy of a stage play. So Shakespeare once said, all the world is a stage and all of us are simply players. I'm paraphrasing that. But Goffman basically kind of built on that idea that if we want to understand how we interact with each other, think about life as a stage play, and we're each playing roles. And again, I'm going to oversimplify a lot of what Goffman said in this idea of dramaturgy, but it gives you an idea about one way we could study microsociology and study how society works from a micro standpoint by talking about this. So when you think about an actor is on a stage performing in front of an audience. So if we think about society as the audience, what we're saying is how well we play our roles will be interpreted by the audience's reaction. So if an actor goes up and on stage and does a very good job, the audience will applaud and give a standing ovation, and then the actor knows that he or she has done a good job. If we get up there and we don't play our role appropriately, and we're back to that idea of roles and playing them, then we might not get a favorable reaction from the audience. We might not get the applause or the laughter that we want, or worse, we could get actually booed, even negative feedback, in which we know when we're not operating in the way that society anticipates. Goffman went so far as to describe things like front stage and backstage, using these terms from the theater. So when is an actor on front stage? When they're out and performing in front of an audience, playing a role, such as I'm doing right now. Goffman would say, I am front stage. I am playing the role of a sociology professor, and I am performing for the camera, but obviously also for the students who are viewing this, your interpretation and your understanding of how well I'm doing this is going to be reflected in the things you say in your essays and how well you perform on exams, that kind of stuff. Then Goffman goes on to say, what's backstage? Well, backstage is when an actor walks off the stage and usually then stops doing the role that they were playing. So if you were playing Shakespeare, if you were playing Hamlet, let's say on stage, and then you walk backstage and continue to talk in the Shakespearean voice and refuse to take off your costume and drove home in a cab, you know, dressed as Hamlet, it wouldn't be appropriate. You are now expected to resume another identity, probably what we might call yourself, and when you go home to your family and friends, you are backstage. So you take off your tie if you're wearing one. You know, you change out of your business clothes, you put on your comfortable clothes, your speech changes, your interactions with people change, and you are backstage according to Goffman. So again, I'm oversimplifying and certainly not going into a lot of detail from Goffman's theories, but it lets us know that we can use these theoretical perspectives to study individuals' behavior in society. One other thing that we can talk about, and this is a fun one, we sometimes talk about this idea of ethnomethodology, a complicated word for a very simple idea. When we study ethnomethodology, we're basically studying how people do things. Okay? As we've talked about before, people have kind of preconceived notions or ideas, cultural norms and understandings about the way quote-unquote things should be done, okay? And ethnomethodology is kind of a fun way of studying and sometimes challenging people's notions about how things should be done. And I've often recommended, if you want to see some funny videos, just go on YouTube and do a search on ethnomethodology. Lots and lots and lots of sociology students over the years have been challenged to do little exercises in ethnomethodology, and you can look these up. And you know, there's all sorts of examples of some of the things I'm talking about. For example, if I were to say that this area right in front of me is an elevator, okay, and I'm standing in a hallway, and the elevator door is open, and I step into the elevator, and there's already, let's say, 5 or 6 people in there. I can say to you, as the doors close behind me, what is the standard or expected behavior that I'm supposed to engage in? And most people will say, well, as soon as you step in the elevator, you're supposed to turn around and look at the numbers. You know, press your number where you're going, and then kind of ride there quietly until you get to your destination. Well, who said? I mean, where did we learn that? At what point in society do you maybe recall being given a class in elevator behavior, or you know, how to get to the floor you're going to without disturbing anybody? No, these are assumptions that we make, that are cultural beliefs that we're taught. And then what I've said to some people, you want to study ethnomethodology, next time you get into an elevator, don't turn around. Stand and look at the other people in the elevator. Make eye contact. Again, back to that idea that we were talking about over here. Start singing. Sing happy birthday. Ask if it's anybody's birthday in the elevator. Sing happy birthday to them. Quiz everybody on what floor they're going to, or how their day's going. Again, depending on people's reactions, I advise people not to do things that are going to get them in any trouble or provoke any other people into bad behavior. But when we challenge other people's notions about how they should behave in situations where there are no specific rules, we're basically engaging in the study of ethnomethodology. Some other silly examples I've given before are, you know, if I were to take a dollar bill out of my pocket and put it in my mouth right now, many of you would get very visibly disturbed by that, probably gag, because we know money is a horribly awful, dirty thing that's been handled by lots and lots and lots of people, and yet we all have to use it and have it on our persons all the time. So a challenge I've always made is go to a laundromat with a basket full of money, you know, hopefully just dollar bills. I don't know how rich any of you are that could afford to do it with 20s or anything like that. But, you know, just take a bunch of dollar bills and take them to the laundromat and throw them in the laundry machine. And, you know, put a little soap in there and then turn it on and watch people's reactions. And then when the washer's done, put them in the dryer and turn it on and watch them all go around. You can watch your dollars spinning around. And when people ask what you're doing, just calmly say, I'm washing my money. Right? And again, that's the joke about money laundering is illegal, correct. It makes perfect sense. It makes absolutely, you know, it's a reasonable thing to do, because money is so necessary and we have to carry it around. We know it's so dirty, to take it to a public place and wash it, and yet you're challenging people's notions about how things are supposed to be done. So again, ethnomethodology. The very last thing we want to discuss as an example in microsociology is the idea of the social construction of reality. Henslin in your text uses an example for this where he talked about watching a bread vendor, I believe it was in the city of Morocco. So bread vendors walking through a town with a big wagon full of loaves of bread, and the custom is for people in the upper balconies just to lean out, say how much bread they want, throw down some money, and the bread vendor throws it up to them. And in the example he gives, Henslin talks about a bread vendor throwing a loaf up to a woman in a balcony and missing and bouncing off the balcony and landing in the street, a very dirty street that's, you know, basically unpaved mud that's been frequented by lots of animals, cart animals as well as dogs, and then picking the loaf up and throwing it up and missing again and having it land down on the street again, and the third time picking it up and throwing it, and the woman catching it and waving at him and going inside and feeding the bread to her family. Again, we can say, why was that? How would that have occurred in our society? Well, clearly in our society, we have a very strong belief and a lot of cultural behaviors built around the acknowledged presence of germs, right? So we're very germ conscious. We acknowledge the existence of germs. Everywhere you go, there are hand washing stations, and we're told any food that falls on the floor, 5-minute rule or 5-second rule exception, you know, we're not supposed to pick up and put back in our mouths. We tell children, put that down, that's dirty, you can't eat that was on the floor. So we have all these culturally defined ideas based on our acknowledgement, our shared acknowledgement of germs. In a society such as Henson was talking about in Morocco, basically both people were operating under the assumption that that food is perfectly fine, that they, you know, you could stand in there and say, oh my God, that bread, the loaf of bread is covered in germs, and if the bread vendor believes it's not covered in germs, and the woman in the window believes it's not covered in germs, then their social interaction is completely normal and acceptable to them, whereas it would be unacceptable to somebody who doesn't believe what those two people believe. So when 2 or more human beings get together and we agree on a set of circumstances, and all the people in that interaction agree on the same beliefs, then the consequences of those beliefs become real. So in a sense, we are constructing reality. We often think of reality as being kind of immobile, immutable, that's the way things are. But when we accept this idea of the social construction of reality, we realize that we as human beings have the ability to create our own reality when we interact with other human beings. So, what we can basically say is kind of as a wrap-up, we can look at society from a macro standpoint, again looking at the very large elements of society, things like social class and social institutions, and then we can look at society from a micro standpoint, looking at individuals' behaviors and what happens when we interact with each other. And it's necessary to recognize that both of these perspectives are necessary to a full understanding of society. So when we say things like, why is there a need for macro and micro sociology, it's because we're looking at the total experience of human existence within social environments.